Welcome to Full Prefrontal, the show that exposes the mysteries of executive functions. This show is a collection of conversations about the role of the prefrontal cortex, which impacts your focus, planning, problem-solving, emotional balance, and independence. These conversations will introduce mental tools that will empower you to shift your mindset for a successful life. And now, here's your host, Sucheta Kamath.
Welcome back to Full Prefrontal, exposing the mysteries of executive functions. I am here with our host, Sucheta Kamath. Good morning, my friend. Always good to be with you. So, question for you. If I forget my wedding anniversary, it's not really my fault, right?
That's a great question, Todd. I don't know. Depends what your wife thinks of that. You know, there are many reasons why marriages fall apart. And the real question is, would forgetting the first marriage anniversary or any marriage anniversary, would that be the straw that breaks the camel's back? You know, as I was preparing for today's topic, I searched the phrase husbands forgot anniversary in Google. And guess what? I got almost 2 million hits in about 0.76 seconds. It was fascinating to see so many wives looking for advice and the ways to deal with the marital discord over remembering and forgetting. So here's a story of such a furious wife, okay? So she was really annoyed with her forgetful husband, so reached out to this advice columnist and she asked for some help. So what she wrote was, my husband forgot our first wedding anniversary, and I tried to be all cool and understanding about it, but the truth be told, I'm so bloody furious. He clearly just blanked out the most important day of our life so far, after 12 months. I think this had to be a signal that he doesn't really care as much as he should. She proceeded to ask, do I tell him how I really feel, as he's wondering what's up with me these days because I'm slightly off? He did make up the other day for the anniversary with a card and awful flowers, as he felt guilty when I presented him with beautifully engraved cufflinks. I am so disappointed. So, Todd, as you can see, that this letter seeking an advice kind of scratches the surface of this topic that we're going to talk about. Forgetting to remember an important milestone such as first wedding anniversary is unfathomable. But this story just proves that it's quite possible. It becomes a problem for this couple, not so much because the husband forgot to plan a celebration, but its implication that he might be really not in love with his wife, or not even love her so much so to be bothered with a plan for celebration. The husband in this scenario can run a risk of being perceived as obnoxious, unloving person, or simply the one who doesn't care. So today, Todd, our guest is going to help us understand the truth behind not remembering to remember. So brain's memory centers, along with the central executive, help us remember to remember. And a breakdown in these inner workings of the way memories are created or the memory traces are created and the recall happens in the brain can lead to great amount of frustration and disappointment. So hopefully our guest, his name is Dr. Mark McDaniel. He's a professor of cognitive psychology who's passionate about prospective memory, may help us view these glitches and those who commit these glitches with great compassion. So let me tell you a little bit about Mark. So Professor McDaniel is at the Department of Psychology and the Brain Sciences at Washington University in St. Louis, Missouri. He is also the founding co-director of the Center for Integrative Research on Cognition, Learning, and Education, also known as CIRCLE. Another important aspect of his work includes exploring individual differences in the tendency for learners to focus on abstraction versus learning of examples when attempting to acquire complex concepts while learning. Dr. McDaniel's research in memory and cognition has received over $2 million in grant support from NIH and NASA. And over the last 35 years, he has published over 270 articles, chapters, books in the area of human learning and memory. I own several of his books, including Prospective Memory, Cognitive, Neuroscience, Developmental, and Applied Perspectives. Even though our conversation today will not focus on learning and education, I recommend that the listeners take a look at his fascinating book that he has co-authored in 2014 titled Make It Stick, The Science of Successful Learning.
Sucheta, I'm certainly looking forward to this conversation with Professor McDaniel. I'm thinking about missing anniversaries. I don't know if you are aware, but the date that my wife and I were married was December 12th of 2012. So the date is 12/12/12. I now understand that Mrs. Schnick did that so that I would never, ever possibly forget our anniversary. So great stuff. All right, let's get to it. Here is Sucheta's conversation with Professor Mark McDaniel.
I would like to welcome to the show today Dr. Mark McDaniel, a professor of psychological and brain sciences at the University of Colorado and the founding co-director of the Center for Integrative Research on Cognition, Learning, and Education at Washington University in St. Louis. Dr. McDaniel's research emphasis on prospective memory, which means remembering to perform an intended action at some future moment, has been of great relevance to my clinical practice. Another important aspect of his work includes exploring individual differences in the tendency for learners to focus on abstraction versus learning of examples when attempting to acquire complex concepts. Dr. McDaniel's research in memory and cognition has received over $2 million in grant support from NIH and NASA. Over the past 35 years, he has published over 217 articles, chapters, and books in the area of human learning and memory. I myself own several of his books, and I highly recommend Prospective Memory, Cognitive Neuroscience, Developmental and Applied Perspectives to all the listeners. In 2014, he co-authored a book entitled Make It Stick, The Science of Successful Learning, and it has become an important piece of work for many educators and trainers like me. I can't wait to have a conversation with Dr. Mark McDaniel on the show today. Welcome to the show, Mark. I'm so delighted to have you. Before I get started with my questions, I wanted to quickly share a story with you as to what happened this morning. My mother has been diagnosed with severe spinal stenosis, and she's going to have a surgery. And the surgical nurse called me this morning to do a pre-op preparation call. And as we were talking, she took a detailed history, and then the call went into giving detailed instructions to me about what needs to be happening. One was directions to the clinic, then even the procedure of antibacterial soap that she needs to apply 2 nights, the one night before, one the day of, and then food and dietary restrictions. As I was listening, I started creating a mental checklist of all the things I needed to follow up right after the call. None of these things she had given me in writing, and none of them were going to happen the next minute, which, by the way, I was in the car. And that just put a smile on my face because that's exactly what prospective memory demands look like, right? So Can you start off by telling us what is prospective memory and how do you define it in your field?
In our field, we define prospective memory as the memory task, if you will, in which somebody forms an intention or a plan to perform some action at some later point. And the key is that they can't perform the action immediately, but it's something that must be delayed until the afternoon or delayed until next week or even delayed until the next hour. And then the memory component is remembering at the appropriate time that you want to do this particular task. It might be buying bread on the way home from work. It might be calling a colleague in an hour. It might be calling a relative to wish them happy birthday. So any kind of future plan that you want to implement requires some memory at the moment that you want to implement it. And that's what we term prospective memory.
Got it. So it's mainly memory for the future, not memory for the past. That means once I have learned that capital of India is Delhi, then that's not something that I need to remind myself to remember. How do these mechanisms work in the brain then? Where is the knowledge of something that you learn is stored versus knowledge that I need to do something in the future stored?
Well, Sajeta, we don't think that those two memories are necessarily stored in different places. We actually don't know. People haven't done the kind of neurobiological work needed to understand where these memories are stored. But theoretically, we think they're probably stored in similar locations. We think maybe the hippocampal formations are important for storage of these memories. In fact, when you form an intention to execute an action later, that would be storing memory in much the same way as when you learn the capital of India. The challenge in prospective memory is the later retrieval of that information. So it's probably stored in the same place, but later in a prospective memory task, the challenge is that you have to remember on your own to retrieve that intention and perform it. And that's the big difference between memory for the past. And memory for the past, many times, there are requests to remember, there are requests to think back in the past. So I might ask you, well, what's the capital of India? You would search your memory store and upon my request or on a test, an instructor will ask students, please tell me about the theories of personality, or please solve this statistics problem. In every case, the person is being asked to remember back. In prospective memory, that never happens. In prospective memory, you get to the moment when you have to make the phone call, when you have to wash your hands with that antibacterial soap, when you have to take your medication, and there's no request to remember. The system has to initiate somehow retrieval of that intention, and that's the core unique feature of prospective memory.
I see. So how would you describe that? Let's say if I'm driving and I listen to NPR and an author comes and his new book just has been released, and I make a mental note that, this will be a good book to order on Amazon when I get out of my car, versus I want to lose weight before my wedding, which is in October. So one is more casual intention. I'm not sure if I'm serious about it. But second is more formal intention. Again, I'm not sure if I'm seriously committed to it. But how are they something processed differently, or do we go about it differently?
Well, I think that it's possible that we go about it differently. I don't think that categorically they're necessarily different. That is, I don't think that because one is more serious and one is less serious, that it's treated any differently in the brain. I think that instead, if you're more serious about an intention, you may recruit strategies to increase the chances you're going to remember to do that. So these could be cognitive strategies. They could be things we can talk about later in the podcast in terms of encoding the intention in certain ways. They could be external strategies. So you could post notes, you could write reminders in a calendar, you could set a timer. Or they could be, other cognitive strategies where you do more between when you've thought of the plan and when you're going to execute it, initiate some reminders. So I think that's probably a big difference between the more serious and less serious intentions. We think with the less serious intentions, you may encode those more fleetingly. So you may just have just a fleeting intention that I'm going to remember that author's name so I can buy them at the bookstore next time I get to the bookstore. And I have this often. But that fleeting intention is probably not going to be well retrieved. So that would be the difference between a fleeting intention that's kind of fragile and thus it's not easily retrievable when no one's asking you to remember. Instead, you've got to remember on your own. More serious intentions probably more firmly encoded. It's probably got more retrieval cues associated with it. And for that reason, it's probably better remembered.
I see.
But if you have a serious intention, if it's serious, but then you don't give it much thought, then you'll likely fail at that prospective memory situation. Yes.
It's a leaky dike situation. It has many holes where the information can skip.
It really does. So, yes, that's correct.
So what my experience is with the people with executive dysfunction who have been identified with some sort of a developmental anomaly, such as, either ADHD, or they have had concussion, or they even have some type of undefinable learning disability. I find that their failure in recognizing the distinction between casual or not so serious versus serious intentions. Unfortunately, people's expectations are that they should make these intentions more serious. Like, for example, make a plan to prepare a poster. But the student doesn't perceive that it is not his intention to do that seriously. And so what happens is the intention is not serious. And to me, isn't that the executive process where goal making is where the real crux of the matter lies, not whether the intention is created and then rehearsed? If you have nothing to rehearse, then you are not rehearsing anything, correct?
Yes, well, I guess the way I'd frame it is the following, which is that many times general goals are not followed through on very well. So the general goal of losing weight is not that effective. More effective is to create concrete behavioral plans that are tied to concrete environmental cues. And in that way, you can call that serious or not serious, but it's not the dimension I'm thinking about. I'm thinking about the dimension of creating a really strong link between a behavior and environmental cue, which then allows that intention to be cued by environmental signals. And in that way, you are offloading some of the requirements from the executive system onto a more reflexive automatic retrieval system. So the idea is this: rather than plan to lose weight, the more effective technique is to set up what we call implementation intentions. And the idea is this, is to say, tonight I will ride the exercise bike for 30 minutes when I'm watching the hockey game. So the idea now is that as soon as you turn on the hockey game, you've got a strong link to remind you to get on the exercise bike and ride it. And then the next morning, you can make another intention, which would be to say, today I am leaving work at noon to go swim. And when noon comes around, you have a very concrete signal that reminds you it's time to go swim. And the literature shows, both in the laboratory and in these real-world tasks like writing a term paper, exercising, taking vitamins, that creating these strong linkages between a behavior and a concrete environmental cue produces great prospective memory success. So I don't frame it in terms of serious or less serious. I think if you're more serious, you'll take the trouble to form these implementation intentions. But even if you're not serious, if you are guided or somebody helps you form these implementation intentions, we think that that's going to lead to good prospective remembering. And Sucheta, that's, we think, because you're allowing a more automatic, reflexive memory system to operate rather than this executive system, which for some people, as you noted, can not be functioning at a top level. For those people, I think these implementation intentions are really, really important.
So, Mark, then let's talk about what happens between the time when the intention is created, but the execution or doing of that intention is not yet arrived. Mm-hmm. And that's the ongoing task, as you describe, or it's described in the field. But when I am driving, for example, and an intention of me having to return a phone call, but I'm not going to do that until 2 p.m. in the afternoon, a lot happens between that 10 a.m. phone call and return of phone call at 2 p.m. So what role do these things or life events have on that executionary time, when it's 2 o'clock? What happens to normal brain, or why do people forget?
Well, here's what I think, Sucheta, is that many people, when they form an intention, think that that intention is indelible in memory. And it is true that when the intention is being formed, it is in working memory. It's very accessible. It's in awareness. It's in consciousness. And so it essentially feels to people as if it's unforgettable. What people don't have a good appreciation for is that once that intention leaves working memory, it can easily be forgotten unless there are some cues that stimulate retrieval of that intention from which is now residing in long-term memory. So the mistake many people make in prospective memory is to think, okay, I know I've got to make that call at 2 o'clock, no problem. But now, between 10 a.m. and 2 o'clock, lots of things enter working memory, lots of concerns are at the forefront of your executive system, and that initial intention at 10 a.m. is long gone from working memory. So 2 o'clock rolls around, and the challenge is that somehow you've got to remember to retrieve that intention from long-term memory. It's very unlikely that you'll be able to do that again unless your executive system unless you're recruiting that to give yourself periodic reminders, and that's kind of a challenge because the executive system is going to be involved in other things, or unless you've created, again, some strong cues that you know are going to be present at 2 o'clock that can then remind you of this intention that you've got stored in memory. You've got it stored in memory just like you do your knowledge of the capital of India. The challenge, once again, is to make sure that cues are present to stimulate reminding of that intention. So, again, I think you're almost bound to fail if you say, I've got to remember to call at 2 o'clock when you're in the car at 10 in the morning. If you say, let's see, right after my 1:30 meeting, as soon as I close the door from my 1:30 appointment leaving, as soon as I close the door, I've got to make a phone call. Your chances are better at remembering now because closing that door becomes a cue that's associated with the phone call and has an opportunity to stimulate retrieval of that intention. Otherwise, it's very difficult to recover it. Yes, because your feeling when you encode it is, I'll never forget it. And you won't as long as you keep it in working memory. But as you know, keeping information in working memory is very difficult in the face of much other distracting information that you're going to encounter. Let's put it this way. If your life were so simple that from 10 a.m. to 2 you were doing nothing, and all you had to do was say, I've got to make the call at 2 o'clock, I've got to make the call at 2 o'clock, and you kept rehearsing that, you would be in good shape. But nobody's life is like that. So
That's true.
Yes. So essentially, people think that the prospective memory is going to be easy to remember because it's so indelible when you first think about it. But what the unsuspecting person doesn't realize is as soon as that intention leaves working memory, they will not remember it unless they've got good cues or unless they're executives, unless they say to themselves, it's really important for me to remember to do this. I'm going to keep trying to remind myself. But even that is subject to failure. So I will tell a story about myself that is embarrassing, but it illustrates this point perfectly. Years ago, when my kids were in high school, 2 of them had tennis practice. They typically either drove home or got a ride with a friend. This particular day, neither one of those would work. So they said, Dad, you need to pick us up at tennis practice at 5 o'clock. I said, I will do that. I can do that. So all morning, every so often I say, okay, I got to remember to leave work at 5 and pick my kids up. I got to remember every instant, Sacheta, I was reminding myself. And then I got absorbed in doing some writing on a research paper. And at 6 o'clock, I got a phone call. And it was my kids saying, we're at the tennis court. Where are you? So even a prospective memory researcher like myself with good intentions, even relying on this executive system to remind myself was a failure. And I would have been better off creating reminders associated with that time of day, such as when the sun starts to get dim, you got to remember, or I should have set an alarm or had some reminder that I needed to do that. So I think this is the thing most of us do is we rely on our working memory, we rely on an executive system, and those are prone to failure when you get absorbed in other tasks, as we all do.
So in closing, I wanted to ask you to comment on this thought that I find that what you're describing is that imagination of seeing yourself perform the task or failing to perform, and then taking all the preventative steps to avoid that. And I find that particularly those riddled with attention problems are so consumed when they are in the process of creating new intentions that they don't have this imagination employed, like, so to speak. How would it look like me picking up my son? And even if I did a little quick visual imagery of me driving and picking up my son, pulling over, or whatever it is, and that's what causes people to not do that. So what does the statistics say about normal forgetfulness in the prospective memory domain? How do we understand that? How often people forget to remember the future-oriented
Right.
execution?
Well, we explain it in two ways, and I've already talked about one, which is that some people rely on their executive system to initiate remindings and to interrupt ongoing activities. So one can think about the prospective memory task, and that we already talked about how that's challenging because the executive system's often absorbed in other tasks, and so that produces failures without a doubt. And the other failure is that sometimes the intention's not strongly encoded with environmental cues, and as a consequence, if our executive system is not, there are really two routes to prospective remembering. One is the executive system initiating reminders and disengaging from ongoing tasks so you can think about what it is you have to do next. And the other route is through this retrieval from environmental cues. And oftentimes environmental cues just aren't rich enough or present enough or haven't been thought about when you encoded the prospective memory intention. And so the other failures are because of an absence of cues. So I'll give you an example. Older adults are pretty good at remembering to take their medication when it's a medication that is that they have to take more chronically, unless these older adults are traveling, and then they get out of their usual environmental cues aren't around. So their usual bathroom isn't there, their usual schedule isn't there. And in that case, without those environmental cues, you see forgetting occurring. And this happens to me too. So when I travel, I try to form better intentions about remembering to take whatever medication I have out and put it in sight so that when I'm in the bathroom, I'll see it. That's the best cue you can have, because good prospective memory is usually something that's tied to very predictable environmental cues. And once you get out of those contexts, that's where prospective memory failures often occur. Happens with pilots, Sucheta. They're very good at remembering the routines of what they have to do to get the airplane to lift off the ground. But if that routine is interrupted, sometimes with de-icing, it can be the case that now that the familiar sequence of cues has been interrupted, the pilot doesn't have those cues to remember to lift the flaps as they should. And that usually where there are, and it's very infrequent, but when there are aviation accidents, it's almost always a human error. It's almost always a prospective memory error. And it's almost always because an aviation expert has gotten interrupted from their normal sequence, and now the cues that they've relied upon are no longer there. So those are all factors that play a role in prospective memory forgetting. It's not an easy, this is probably the most challenging task our cognitive system faces, because we got to remember something when no one's asking us to remember, when we're not interrogating memory. The memory has to either occur through internal executive functioning, or it has to be stimulated by environmental cues. So most people think that prospective memories are going to happen kind of without much involvement on their part. Well, that's not quite true. You have to either be involved at the front end in very useful encodings, and I mean, this is something that I try to do all the time now. Otherwise, I'm certain I'm going to forget to do the intention. Or it has to be, you have to be committed to expend executive resources in a very consistent way to remind
Or
yourself.
the last part I will say about that is, or have great social skills to apologize for your faux pas.
Yeah, that's right.
So that people forgive you for constantly being late to pick your child up, or having to fail a commitment,
Yeah, that's another way to handle it. That's correct.
Well, Mark, this has been such a delightful conversation. I can't thank you enough. And before we close our interview, if people want to know more about your research and want to reach out to you, what's the best way to find you?
Well, there's a URL that's psychweb.wstl.edu/McDaniel. That's my website, and that gives publications, and people can download publications from there.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. And we will link that to our podcast as well. Once again, I'm tremendously grateful for your time. Thank you.
Thank you.
All All right, and we're back. And again, that was Professor Mark McDaniel. What a great conversation, Sucheta. Lots to think about here, lots to discuss. I guess we talked a lot about perspective memory. I wonder if you could summarize the concept of perspective memory.
Certainly, Todd. As you heard, remembering and forgetting is the natural course of everyday life. The first takeaway, the way I see it, is prospective memory is remembering to perform an intended action sometime in the future, more so at a designated and appropriate later time. For example, when you're at work, you're thinking of picking up some avocados and limes for a guacamole for the Mexican menu that you have planned for dinner. The trick is to remember to stop and pick up those ingredients before you get home, but after you leave work. The chances are you simply forget to do until you are standing at the kitchen counter and beginning to gather ingredients to make the guacamole, only to discover that you don't have the necessary ingredients and you certainly forgot to stop at the grocery store. In short, perspective memory casts a long shadow forward. And that's really like the best way to summarize a perspective memory.
Do you know how many ingredients I have forgotten over the years? Goodness gracious. You know, what's so fascinating about this, Sucheta, is how many things go into this process of perspective memory. And it's only then that we remember to remember, right?
Yeah, that's right, Todd. The takeaway here is that the perspective memory has three specific components. One is forming an intention to do something at a specific later time. The second is rehearsing that intention from now until that specific time in the future. And while the stuff of life happens, which is kind of can interrupt our remembering. And then the third component is executing or performing the intended action at that appropriate time. There's a gap or a delay between forming that initial intention and actually performing or executing that action. And this gap may be a few minutes or a few hours or days or weeks or months or even years. So just remember, forgetting is easier than remembering.
Yeah, what's so fascinating here, Sucheta, is that it sounds like even those with good memory are not spared from this problem. I mean, it's interesting to me how often this happens to most of us, right?
Yes, certainly. And, you and I both have been victims of prospective memory failure. So that's exactly the next takeaway point, that forgetfulness is truly a commonplace phenomenon that Mark kind of emphasized, that remembering to remember and forgetting to remember are two sides of the same coin, in a way, if you can think about it. Whether we recall to do or say or do something in the future depends on how we encode our intentions. By the way, to encode means to analyze, process, and attach meaning to that intention that you are trying to remember. If we do it firmly and deliberately, we will remember to remember. More firmly the intentions are encoded, greater the retrieval cues associated with it. But if we are distracted or we are not super motivated or we are not committed to that intention that we, so to speak, want to remember in the future, the encoding is weak and the intentions are processed fleetingly in the brain. And of course, this guarantees that you will not remember or you will certainly forget.
Well, what's also interesting to me is, I guess cocky is the right word, how cocky people feel about their future intentions and the plans they make. And Lord knows I've certainly done that. I mean, we go about our day without any worry and that we would never possibly forget anything and what needs to be done, but boom, and then it happens. I mean, this is a real hassle in everyone's in everyday life.
Well, Todd, that's the last takeaway point. The biggest reason we think we won't forget is because our intentions feel so fresh or completely unforgettable in the moment when we form them. Take this example. As I get in bed at night and tell myself to take the running shoes to work so that I can go straight to the workout right after I leave my office, my imagination paints this vivid picture about tomorrow. And I go to bed without actually keeping the shoes by the door. What my imagination fails to produce is me getting up late and rushing out the door and leaving the bag and the computer in different places and then having to gather all that and grabbing a cup of tea with me. And it fails to help me imagine this scenario of chaos as I'm trying to remember to remember. So if you are serious about your intentions, you need to take the trouble and put in greater effort to not only make a mental note, but to take some specific steps to prevent any glitches from happening. I want our listeners to remember a distinction, though, that remembering to take my shoes to work is different from remembering the capital of Japan is Tokyo. And so this is where the confusion comes from cocky people who have great memory to not know that they will actually forget to remember. So here's what happens. When you form the intention to remember from a memory standpoint, that remembering that the capital of Japan is Tokyo is no different than remembering to pick up putting the shoes next to the door and taking them to work. Real difference is the having to remember to recall the shoes on your own without anybody's help is really the distinction. When you're trying to learn the capitals, and particularly you did that, let's say in sixth grade history class, somebody subjected you to a test which required you to have to recall again and again with prompts and without prompts, which made you search into your memory bank, and eventually it got cemented and then transferred into permanent storage. With respect to prospective memory, it's completely a different ballgame. Without any request or recall, that means nobody at night asked me, including my husband, honey, what are you going to remember to take to work tomorrow? Or when I got up in the morning and I was rushing out the door, nobody stopped me and say, hey, what was that important thing you were trying to remember? So there is no rehearsal. There is no recall practice. And so without that request for recall, the memory system really has a hard time checking into the memory bank what all that needs to be remembered. So the stuff we think of remembering to do, but that never gets encoded in the brain properly, vanishes into the thin air. And that's why we forget so readily, no matter how good our memory is.
Fascinating stuff. A lot of great takeaways from your conversation with Professor Mark McDaniel. All right. All the time we have for today's episode. On behalf of our host, Sucheta Kamath, and all of us at Cerebral Matters, thank you for tuning in and listening today, and we look forward to seeing you next week on Full Prefrontal.
Thank you for listening to Full Prefrontal, Exposing the Mysteries of Executive Functions. To contact our host, Sucheta Kamath, and learn more about her work on improving executive functions, visit her website at cerebralmatters.com. That's cerebralmatters.com. Tune in next week for the next informative episode of Full Prefrontal.